are here today to follow this very, very important discussion. I think the idea for it originated in, I think, me and Claude. We were at PGM Minerals in Daba, and Professor Joseph Sekumbi also attended, and other members of the business school. And we thought to perhaps continue with the discussion here in a Pitso at the business school. And I want to welcome Kaya Setole, who will moderate this discussion here today. But then our panelist, Stravos Nicolaou from Aspen Pharma Group, Wandile Gihlobo, Chief Economist at AGBIS, and then Claude de Bissac, founder of Genomics. I must admit, before I met him, I didn't know about him, so but he reminded me of the importance of what he's doing during that discussion, and it's lovely to have you all here. Thank you very much, Kaya. You can take it away.
Thank you, Pete, and good afternoon to everyone on this very extraordinary week that has obviously been dominated by the conversation about what happens when the man who lives in the White House decides to stand up and say something, or more importantly, once he decides to sign something. We've seen a series of executive orders since the beginning of the year, and South Africa has, of course, been at the epicenter of some of those particular conversations. But perhaps it was that moment in the Rose Garden when he stood up and he brandished a chart where it really reached fever pitch. And I think not since Neville Chamberlain claimed that he had found a way to appease Hitler have we seen a piece of paper having such a monumental impact on the world at large. Today, I'll be speaking to three individuals who monitor these conversations much closer than I do. And of course, they have some very important insights to share with us on what this all means, not only for the African continent, but for the world at large. If you'd like to sort of express some views and some comments, please do use the chat box. And if I'm able to pick up some of those questions, we'll be able to fill them to our panelists. Now, I'm going to start firstly with the very basics. There has been a bit of confusion, I suppose, in some circles about exactly what tariffs are and who pays them. And I think in a world where information becomes as fluid and becomes as negotiable as it is now, it's always important for us just to start off there. So, Claude, I'd like to come to you first. I mean, just talk us through, very simple, what exactly is a tariff to begin with?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please? I'm having some technical difficulties here trying to adjust everything. All Firstly, right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first question that I'd like to pose to you, can you please just give us a summary? What exactly are tariffs?
What exactly are tariffs?
Yes.
Right. It's a tax on imported goods, or they could be on exported goods. Tariffs are simply that. It's a levy that the state imposes upon the international trade, and sometimes, funnily enough, there are internal tariffs. That used to be the case in the pre-modern era. Tariffs as a tax that the state leverages on the value of imported goods, and they are part of what we call tariffs and non-tariff barriers. The reason why we call them barriers now is because of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who came up with a theory that tariffs and non-tariff barriers are bad things for economics. And this is something that we are going to have to discuss because in an essay I just published online, I said that, the Trump's tariff war is effectively not just a return to pre-war politics, right? But in fact, to pre-modern economics. The rejection of 300 years of demonstrated, proven, with caveats, obviously, economic theory. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, Claude. And also, one of the key issues is that when Donald Trump was on his campaign trail, he seemed to be promoting the idea that tariffs are going to be what other countries pay in order for them to be able to trade with the United States. And of course, a lot of people are trying to figure out, well, exactly where does the burden lie? So whatever tariff regime we're talking about, who exactly bears the burden for paying tariffs in a normal turn of events? Never mind what's been happening in the past week.
Well, it's a consumer that pays the tariff in the end, right? In the consumer that pays the tariff And so there is a kind of, and it's not proportional, right? An increase of 25% in tariffs doesn't lead necessarily to increase of prices in 25%. Usually it's less. But we've never seen a trade war or imposition of this kind of blanket tariffs on the basis of this weird methodology imposed on all goods on all countries at the same time. And so we just don't know what the impact will be on consumer prices and on economic growth and on inflations. We are already seeing the manifestation of panic through the bond market. It's such a radical, unreasonable move that doesn't have any foundation in modern trade theory, modern economic development theory. And it's never been done like that by the largest economy in the world. And the best analog that I can come up with, and that was my essay, which is on LinkedIn. I mean, I've sent it to The Atlantic for consideration after people told me it's actually quite good, so I was surprised. The best analog I can think of is Louis XIV's L'État c'est moi, right? And his imposition of Colbertism, which is, also called in English bullionism, that notion that wealth, when you import stuff from overseas, from other countries, you are reinforcing their economy at the expense of yours because you have to send your gold out, and gold reserves are the basis of your absolute wealth. And that's what I meant by rejection of Ricardian economics. It's a reversal to very, very primitive economic theory, but it corresponds to Trump's personality. It corresponds to his politics. It corresponds to who fundamentally he was and always was, is I win at the expenses of everybody else, right? And when I lose, I declare bankruptcy. Or I become president so that I don't go to jail. For me, that's
very interesting.
That's it.
Yeah. Stavros, I'd like to come to you now. I mean, surely the idea of international trade is a well-established one, but sometimes people struggle to understand its importance. And I think in the country that we live in, whenever people are angry about something, they just say, well, why can't you switch from A to B? Why can't you switch from East to West? I think the complexities underpinning international trade are sometimes not very well understood. Can you just talk us through the importance of trade with international partners and why it matters particularly for a country like South Africa?
Firstly, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and a delight to be here with you today. I'm going to present, I think, what is a more practical, pragmatic business view. And I think at the heart of your question is how closely do we align our foreign policy with economic policy in our country, particularly in a country such as ours, which has had over a decade of at best pedestrian growth, some of the highest unemployment records in the world, and all the other socio-economic challenges that are well known to all of us. I would suggest that, of course, foreign policy cannot not only be about economic policy, but the suggestion here is that it should certainly form a significant part of our foreign policy. Meaning, and put differently, as you alluded to, a country like ours with these economic challenges cannot afford to be partisan or parochial to any particular geography or region in the world. I'm reminded, because we were talking, because Claude, or in fact, you, Kaya, told us about Neville Chamberlain earlier, right? So let me quote Henry Kissinger, the now deceased former foreign secretary of the U.S. He once said that America has no friends, it only has interests. And there's there's a strong ring of truth in all of that, because at the end of the day, you have to look at what represents your best interests. And for South Africa, where we are at present, our best interests are served in the West, in the East, and in the emerging South. Okay, I'm not going to say the North because that suggests Greenland, so I'm not going there, right, for obvious reasons. But that is how we need to view it. We've got to be open to trading with everyone. What counts here is trade, investment, commerce, and business, all four. Trade is, of course, very important. If we unpack it further, the United States is our second largest trading partner. I'm excluding the EU in sort of aggregated terms. The EU is our biggest trading partner, followed by China, followed by the US. But as a single country, the US is our single biggest trading partner after China. And I think the way we've got to map out things, and I'm quite relieved that we've been a little more measured in our tone in recent times. I think the megaphones are down. We haven't gone knee-jerk response to the tariff, the daily tariffs or sometimes hourly tariff adjustments. I think we're looking at a measured, sober response. That measured, sober response has to be based on empirical analysis. We need to fully understand our trade patterns as South Africa. It's interesting because the US has leveled allegations at times that we favor the BRICS countries and the whole de-dollarization debate. What's interesting for me is that we actually run a trade surplus with the United States. We run a trade deficit with every one of the BRICS plus countries, except the United Arab Emirates, where we're on an even keel. So if I look at China, for example, we run a budget, sorry, we run a trade deficit of in excess of $10 billion. If I look at Russia, Russia's contribution in terms of South African trade in BRICS is less than 1%. It's half the size of Brazil, just to give some perspective on the numbers. If I look at what South Africa exports to the US, there are, and we've done this exercise incidentally, Kaya, line item by line item. And what's interesting is we export more finished goods, value-added goods to the United States. If I look at Russia, there's 0 in the top 10. The closest we get is some agribusiness, Wandile. So one has to look at all of this and say, well, is it worth taking certain political hits? I'm not for 1 second suggesting we betray our morals and our human rights records and all of that. And that's not the suggestion here. But the suggestion is India is a poster child for me here, because they've done a very good job at navigating the East, the West, and the South. They've bought discounted oil from Russia. We haven't bought a single barrel. And yet at the same time, they've kept the US market very buoyant. So I think there's a lesson in all of that. So just to conclude your question you asked me, we can't afford to alienate or isolate any particular region, continent, or geography. We've got to find ways of working with all of them. With the United States specifically, I think AGOA's time was in any case in jeopardy, even during the Biden era. We would have graduated out of AGOA anyway. And I think the suggestion now should be that we sort of, there's a political aspect and a trade aspect here for me. I think we shouldn't confuse the two. I think we have to try and work with the US to find a trade deal that works for both partners. Is it going to be as favorable as AGOA? The answer is no, but we also can't afford to lose everything. Let's try and find a middle road. I think that should be the suggested way forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stavros. Just as a follow-up to that, I think for a lot of people, the curiosity would be, has South Africa changed? Have we done something different in recent years? Or are we dealing with different administrations in the United States that behave differently? Because I suppose if it's a matter of us having started pivoting in a particular direction where we should be able to go back to that inflection point and say, well, what were we thinking? What were the considerations? Is it a matter of them changing, or have we changed, or what has happened?
Look, I think the relationships started off very positively with the Biden administration, and I think started souring, obviously not to the extent we've seen now, where you've had an ambassador expelled. So there's no doubt our problem started before the Trump administration. I think, however, you were dealing with an administration then that was probably more tolerant of some of these things. But it would be inaccurate to say, look, this problem has started with the Trump administration, and that's all we should be looking at. I think there's some historical issues that need addressing on both sides, I believe. And I think that the Trump administration is transactional. I think we've heard and read that widely. And I think we've got to find, on the one hand, placating some of the political issues that are causing the deterioration in the relationship. But on the other hand, there's an economy to run, and you cannot afford to be isolated or alienated from what is the world's largest economy, despite, I think, the many headwinds that the US economy is going to be on a self-imposed basis going to experience. Regardless of that, I think we still need to have all our trade deal options open, east, west, and south.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stavros. One day, Stavros mentioned trade patterns, and I suppose it would be a question of interest to many people and joining in this conversation to understand exactly what our trade flows are, particularly with the United States. Can you give us some insight into exactly what it is that we trade with them, and also, quite importantly, how valuable that is in terms of the numbers of employment that are involved, or even the value of the goods that we currently exchanging with them? Can you get some insights on that?
Yeah. So thanks, Kaya, for that, and good afternoon to all of the colleagues joining us online. I think, Kaya, the starting point, just before getting into your question, I would like to underscore is the one that Stavros is ending with, which is a sense that in the US, we have always been encountering a number of challenges. And I mean, you yourself will remember this in 2014, when we were having a conversation about the renewal of AGOA, which is a unilateral engagement, the US offering us that access at a tariff-free for a range of products. At the time, there was already two aspects that were coming up. One being the fact that we needed to graduate out of AGOA. We were an upper middle income country in a categorization of it in that way. And secondly, there were friction around the poultry issues, pork aspects, and even after that, we had the intellectual property situation that came up. We had the Lady R matters, and of course, under the Trump administration, the issues around BRICS, the issues around the Middle East policies. So the point is that there's already a lot of friction that was there, which I think for me, in thinking about a predictable pathway then that South Africa needed to have with the US in recognition of the significance of trade, as Trav as well as Claudia had already made the point that they are the second largest trading partner of South Africa, big in the autos, big in the mining, and of course the sector that I work in agriculture, also significant on that. The key point then is that how do you engage with the United States given all of these difficulties? And I think in the South African corridors, in many business side, which is where both Strav and Cloud are sitting at, as well as in government, where some of us also partially assisting, there was already this conversation that a free trade agreement is perhaps the best path at which South Africa need to engage with the US. But of course, if we do go then that pathway, we have to understand as South Africa that we need to give something to get something. It's no longer going to be a one-way path. Those trade-offs, we needed to be ready to make those necessary trade-offs. It's not going to be a preferential trade agreement where you can protect all of your particular sectors and say you are only wanting to focus on a particular one. And I think that's the approach at which South Africa was having, and even at this time, that we should continue to have in engaging with the US beyond the close by near term friction that we are having, because ultimately the United States will remain one of those important aspects. Let me close with one point on agriculture, because I see that I have evoked emotion on cloud around the free trade agreement. I hope that he's not raising that hand to disagree. But I think in the agricultural sector in which we are sitting in, Kaya, the US is important. And I think there's a misleading number that gets to happen, Kaya, because when you look at agricultural exports in South Africa, they are about $13.7 billion, which was last year's figure, up 3% from the previous year. We are growing. And the US is about 4% of that, around just under $500 million, 488 million US dollars. But then people may say, okay, if it's 4%, why are we sweating? Why can't we be focusing on the other regions? The reality of it, that 4% is concentrated in a few commodities: your citruses, nuts, wine, table grapes, and the others. And also regionally, you have the Western Cape being overweight, followed by Mpumalanga in those benefits of agricultural access into the US. So regardless of what the numbers are, the point remains that this is an important market, and we need to be looking at other areas in terms of expansion, but at the same time retaining the access to the US, and an FTA may be a best path to get in there. Let me not call the numbers, because I see that Claudia had already raised his point. Let me shut up and see if he's not differing on this point. Thanks, Guy.
Thank you. Claude, any comments on that?
No, I'm in agreement. Violent agreement. But my observation is I'm in agreement with Stavros too. South Africa is a trifling international power. It has punched politically above its weight for a long time, thanks to the Rainbow Nation miracle and story. But that was a long time ago. And it's not just that the US has changed, that also the politics in South Africa have fundamentally changed over the past 15, 20 years. And so South Africa has a role in the deterioration of the trade relations and the disputes around trade, as well as in the diplomatic relation. And what concerns me, and that goes to Stavros's point, is South Africa's role. I mean, we are the proverbial grass, in the battles of the elephants. And so are we going to continue having a schizophrenic diplomacy, which is increasingly anti-American, irrespective of Trump? I mean, it was already increasingly anti-American under Barack Obama, right? And Biden, or are we going so a schizophrenic identity whereby the ANC and a large part of the populist parties have a vested interest, so they think, an ideological interest in being anti-American and anti-Western, while the economy is still rooted to the West. And by that, what I mean is this: yes, China has become our first trade partner, but China is behaving with us very much as a new mercantilist, right? China is not investing in manufacturing except a couple automotive plants that haven't delivered in any case. China isn't interested in being a partner in the reindustrialization of South Africa. As a matter of fact, there is a strong correlation between South Africa's deindustrialization and the rise of China as an exporter of final goods in Africa, and as a rise of an importer of our unbeneficiated products. So China ain't our friends on an economic standpoint, in the sense that it's not the alternative we want, right? Because we can't compete against China's manufacturing goods and industrial might. So if we were to say, all right, screw the West, okay, from a political standpoint, we're going to moor ourselves to the emerging China world, we will be relegated to exporting unprocessed agricultural goods, unprocessed minerals, unprocessed whatever, and we will be, you know, a powerless country. One example I just saw this morning, I mean, which gives you a sense of how poorly equipped Africa is to deal with this trade war and the consequences, is the president of Côte d'Ivoire announced this morning that they were considering taxing exports to the US on cocoa nuts, right? It's like, I mean, is that it? Is that all we have? Well, yes, it is. So let's be clever there. There is a comparative advantage that South Africa has relative to the US and to Europe in terms of being able to do manufacturing stuff, which it simply doesn't have with China. So we need to reconcile the economic policy and now our diplomacy to what I think Stavros has said, which is non-aligned, friends to everyone, enemy to none, and keep your mouth shut.
Stavros, I want to take you back to a moment in March 1998 in particular. So Bill Clinton is here in South Africa. He meets with Nelson Mandela, and at that point in time, it was in the drafting stages for what ultimately became AGOA. And Nelson Mandela did indeed raise the issue of these conditionality clauses that the United States was putting AGOA, particularly in relation to the question of diplomatic relations and those elements of national security, which is obviously defined by the United States. So it's not something that is new to the conversation. And I think for some reason, we were able to make it work from 2000 up until now. We've managed to live through it. This escalation, is it simply based on a series of recent events, or is it, as Oandile had already intimated, we're always going to graduate out of AGOA anyway, but perhaps because of some of the diplomatic missteps that we might have engaged in, and maybe because some of the emboldened approaches that current US politicians have towards the diplomatic question, that has now seen the type of escalation, which now makes it look like South Africa is the problem child. But I think everybody will say that, look, some of these clauses have always been problematic in relation to what it means for countries determining their own agenda. What's your recollection of how that pathway or that history of AGOA has led us to the stage?
Yeah, firstly, I'm pleased that you're reminding me of 1998, because I suspect many of my fellow panelists were still at school then, but I wasn't. Like Wandile, I think.
You was probably in primary school.
My age belies the facts, I think. So look, I think it's the best way to respond is that we have to have a look at the trade and economic response from this particular administration, the 47th administration. Has it only been targeted at South Africa, or has it been targeted more broadly from an AGOA perspective? So the tariffs that were announced, by my understanding, would supersede any AGOA preferences. So in any case, the day Liberation Day happened on the 2nd of April, AGOA was dead in the water anyway, because any product or sector that was included in AGOA for which you now had tariffs, my understanding and interpretation is that that sector would fall off AGOA, and the only thing that would be left is whether Congress reauthorizes AGOA or not. Now, there are legal interpretations going on about that, and it's something we're watching quite closely, because some are saying that the President Trump has overreached and he doesn't have the authority. What we do know definitively, though, is AGOA has to go to Congress for reauthorization. And if we're still working off a summation that the Republicans have a majority in Congress, then in any case, it's unlikely to be reauthorized. So what I'm saying in a very long and windy road in answering your question is that I think some of this writing was on the wall anyway. So we can't say it was specifically targeted because of how President Trump or Elon Musk thinks about us. Okay. The second thing is that some have said, but he's cut the donor aid funding to us. He hasn't done that. He's done that to countries in Latin America. It's tragic, by the way. Kaya, in my sector, we are likely to see the unraveling of all the progress we've done in HIV/AIDS. But it's not just in our country. There are other neighboring countries that have been affected. There are programs in Myanmar. There are programs in Singapore. You can pick your country around the world where the donor aid funding has stopped. So that would suggest to me that there are two pathways here. The first pathway is on the economic and trade aspect of it. The writing was on the wall, and the Trump administration has a very particular way of dealing with trade surpluses. And if you were high, you got tariffed. If you were low, you got less of a tariff. But it looks like everyone got tariffed. So it's not only aimed at South Africa. Okay, that's on the trade and economic side of things. I don't think any better or worse than anybody else, other than we've got higher tariffs because we had a trade surplus with them. Right? On the political side, this is where the problem comes in, because where you could get a targeted sanction is if you start getting sanctions aimed at individuals, or even, God forbid, that our banks start getting affected. Now, that would be a political consequence. And then you could say, look, if that happens, yes, we pushed the political envelope too far. Okay, so I'm very clear in my mind that there kind of two pathways here. There's the political one, and that's where you could look at sanctions. And then I don't think it will happen as, you know, as Russia's been sanctioned, for example, and that it would be catastrophic for our banks. But that's the political pathway. And then the trade and economic pathway, I think we're no better or worse off than all the other countries that have been affected. Just lastly, Kai, if I may, just on the donor funding, we probably are, so everyone's had their donor funding affected, but we do as Africans have quite a heavy reliance from PEPFAR, USAID and UNAIDS, and also the NIH, in that, and I do want to draw quite a strong red flag here. Through that funding, we've been able to build some of the most significant HIV and TB research capability of any country in the world, and the world relies on us for that research. And here I'm talking about world-renowned researchers such as Glenda Gray, Slim Karim, Francois Fenter. I can roll all the names off, Shabir Mahdi, all of these people. They're world-class scientists. We've always used that, Kaya, to position our country to investors, to say, look, we've got fantastic research capabilities. We've got we've got strong medical research capabilities, with a fantastic healthcare system, certain, private sector healthcare system. So come and invest in South Africa, If we start losing that, I think we're going to have to do some adjusting and repositioning on how we position our country to certainly to foreign investors. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Stavros. Wandile, I think, again, a lot of people still struggle to understand this idea of AGOA, why it's relevant, and what exactly the implications are. And obviously, for all the exports that we do make to the United States, not everything gets a 0% tariff, which is what the AGOA products were. So on the balance, what was the volume, or rather the value of trade that was benefiting from that particular concession versus the balance of trade that was simply subject to the normal tariffs? And I think the importance of that is for us to then deliberate on, well, if AGOA had expired through natural attrition, we would still be exporting to the US, but does that mean that lower volumes or lower exports? And more importantly, now that we are playing in the spectrum of 0% versus 10% versus 31%, what becomes the immediate implications of whatever number the United States decides to apply at any point in time?
Yeah, so I think the a few things in here that assist perhaps maybe for folks to get an appreciation of this is this. Before the Trump administration went on with all of its tariff measures, if you were outside of AGOA, the tariffs in the US were pretty much very low. On average, you were pretty much dealing with about 3% tariffs on the most favored nations on average. And to be clear, to Cloud's point, the tariffs were not paid by the South African companies or South Africans, but by the importing company. They get to be a tax on the US consumer, and the companies that bring in the products, they decide how much of that they pass on to the consumer and over what amount of time. But when you are facing the tariffs as a country, while your competitor doesn't face the tariffs, it does make yourself then and your products to be uncompetitive in that particular market, which is why we all always want to either face no tariffs or face the relatively lower tariff compared to whoever we are competing with in accessing a market for a particular product. Now, looking at all of this, some of the products were under AGOA, some were under GSP. So not everything was under AGOA. And in fact, you could argue that AGOA was taking roughly about a half or even slightly less than that of the products that were going into the US market, which is why then in our thinking already at that time, we're saying as we graduate out of this, we needed to get into the US under some form of a free trade agreement so that we continue to export in a competitive rate within that US markets. That's why the general thinking was getting out there. But I do think that in South Africa, there was already, especially if you look at social media, this whole doomsday fatalistic mindset of saying, look, you are outside of AGOA, therefore you are blocked into the US market. The issue of either you were losing AGOA or not had a lot to do with how competitive your product in the American market, not whether you can access it or not. If we were outside of AGOA, we're not going to be completely outside of the US market. We're just going to face those particular tariffs. Now then, to Stav's point, we are out because these tariffs have pretty much nullified AGOA, although we are not technically at the space at which Congress has already said, look, you're still going to get that consideration, but it has been nullified. And I think this is where the conversation has to begin to say, with the organizations or companies that are affected at the moment, what is South Africa's near-term way of engaging with the US, as well as the long-term approach, which then should involve the free trade. The last point I'll make here, look at that example, Kaya, of Kenya. When Kenya began to see where things were heading to, they began engaging with the Trump administration way before to say they needed to move to a FTA, which is the whole Kenya-US trade agreement that they were starting on. That's the path that South Africa should, we were thinking of starting, we should have started. But the complexity, and I hope Claudia can argue or can add views on this, is also the fact that we are in a customs union with some of the countries that are not in the same standing as South Africa in terms of the economic profile, which arguably still qualifies within the AGOA had it not been these tariffs of late. Then now striking that free trade agreement while you are having the SACU partnership is something that we needed as ourselves as South Africa to think about how we can go forward on that. But people like Claudia and perhaps maybe staff can add on that particular point. But it does introduce complexities about how South Africa engages in terms of a bilateral agreement with certain countries. Thanks.
Thanks. Claudia, just before you respond to that, I'd also like you to just take our members through an explanation of what the idea of reciprocal tariffs is, because obviously when Trump started talking about it, he said, well, they're doing it to us, so we're doing it to them. And suddenly we saw 60% and everyone was like, really, could we be doing that? The idea of reciprocal tariffs, where exactly did it emanate from, and is it a valid proposition by Mr. Trump? So if you can just take us through that and also add to what Wandile said.
Look, reciprocal tariffs are the foundation of international trade, right? And we have the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades, which was set up in 1947 as the rulemaking for international trade, which then was superseded but remains in force by the World Trade Organization. Came up with this notion of the least favored nation. So in essence, you are bound, except for some products that were protected. Sugar, for example, was protected, and textile were protected because trade is fundamentally an economically disruptive activity between countries that have different economic sizes and they have different sets of competitiveness and industrial sectors. So trade has to be modulated very carefully between countries. So the notion of reciprocity, a reciprocal trade, reciprocal tariff is in theory the way it's supposed to work. So if France has a certain tariffs for certain goods to the US, then in theory, the US is obligated to extend that tariff level, if it's the lowest, to other countries, most favored nation. What Trump is doing here is a misnomer. It's an abuse of the term reciprocal tariffs. These aren't reciprocal tariffs. They are punitive, and they're not even retaliatory tariffs. Because there is no economic basics for them. They are political. Tariffs. They are not meant to equalize things. They are meant to bully countries, the world economy, to come to the table and to effectively meet Trump's demands, whichever they are, which then says that since those tariffs are fundamentally political, diplomatic, the answer needs to be political and diplomatic. And this is where I join what you say, Wandile. Kenya understands that. India understands that, Indonesia understands that, South Africa doesn't seem to want to understand that. Now, so that's on the reciprocity, but imposing an increase, imposing 108% tariff on China isn't reciprocal because China does not impose those levels of tariffs to the United States. It has trade and it has non-tariff barriers. So China is actually a very protectionist economy when it wants to be and where it wants to be, to the same extent that South Korea and Taiwan were in the 1970s, 80s, when they were industrializing. This is not an economic battle we are seeing. It's a geopolitical battle. And the tariffs are a geopolitical tool. So don't apply economic reasoning to what we are seeing. Apply political, geopolitical reasoning. On AGOA, and I'd like to come back to that, I agree, AGOA has become superseded, it's a moot point. But AGOA, insofar as South Africa was concerned, increasingly became a political diplomatic, if you want, barometer of the relationship between the countries. And the US was removing South Africa from AGOA to signal its displeasure with South Africa's, and particularly the ANC's, policies. And there I'm going to touch a little bit on that. I just attended 2 hours ago a fascinating talk from someone, sorry, his first name escapes me, Corrigan from IRR, where he made a kind of long presentation on the US-South Africa relations since the inception of the two countries. And he observed, that the US has a very complex relationship with South Africa, long-standing and very complicated, because South Africa has had attributes of the US in its own constitution and history. Colonial, Dutch, English, wars, civil wars, elimination, slavery, genocidal intents, racist policies, etc. So South Africa is an interesting mirror to the US. And I fear what this government needs to do and is not doing is really apply its mind. And I think this is where business and academia and civil society needs to be, is lobby South Africa to the ANC, particularly in government, to really think hard about the costs and benefits of engaging in what would become an ideological war over whether South Africa should or not support Hamas and Israel and Iran and all of that, and the BRICS, and therefore we need to really kind of take a step back and look at this, interpret it for what it is, and find the opportunity. And I'd like to say here, this presents a tremendous opportunity. And I hate to say crisis present opportunities because it's a cliche. But it does present an opportunity in the sense that I think that the natural alignment that both politically and economically serves South Africa's interest is to tie up a very close relationship with the European Union. Very close, because there is value-based, there is democratic, there is rule of law, there is a very strong civil society, there is I think, and South Africa has a competitive advantage there, right? South Africa could, if it could find its way to abandon this idiotic industrial policy that has failed and said, we are open for business, we are going to create real special economic zones, we are going to welcome all sorts of economic activities in agriculture, in sectors, forget about manufacturing, we're dead. Let's reinvent, let's use this to reinvent the positioning, and let's take a leaf indeed out of countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and India, who know how to play the game. Sorry, it's a long one, but my apology.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Stavros, I have a bit of a challenge here, because I suppose with AGOA approaching the end in its current form in September, there was always going to be a question of, well, if the answer, even under normal terms, was that South Africa had grown out of AGOA, for example, then the question of a trade agreement between the two countries was already something that we should have been considering. I don't know if we were, but in this particular instance, Wandile refers to what Kenya has done, the steps that they have taken. For South Africa, if the answer is to be that, well, not only has AGOA been nullified due to these executive orders, but it was going to expire anyway, or at least South Africa's participation is going to expire, then the question of starting conversations around the trade agreement are important. But those conversations hinge on the availability of the diplomatic channels and those diplomatic bridges that you need to have to start those conversations. South Africa currently has no such thing. What does this mean?
Okay, so firstly, let me preface my response just by saying that we can take two views on AGOA. We can take a view that everything that's been tariffed will be excluded in the event that there is a slim chance of some reauthorization. So I think we're never going to give up the hope of a reauthorization. At best, you might get a moderated reauthorization. It's a very slim prospect, but one that I think we shouldn't give up the ghost on just yet. So that's my first comment. The second thing is a very valid question. How do you negotiate a trade deal if all the channels are closed? And who negotiates those trade deals? There's a strong sense that the White House negotiates these things, and not even the Commerce Secretary, right? So how are we going to get into the White House? Now, there have been some interactions with the White House, not very extensively so, and not at a very high level. So the suggestion here is, in parallel to readying ourselves for a trade deal of sorts, I think we've got to keep laying the groundwork, which means groundwork with the White House, which means putting the megaphones down. I think we've done that in the last 2 weeks. You can argue we weren't doing that before that, but I think it's a good sign. We might have to make some compromises here. Renaming Santon Drive, for example, to put that back on the agenda when we're in this heated moment with the US makes absolutely no sense. So I think in conclusion to your question, we are going to require, I think, firstly, a more technical level of diplomatic engagement to lay the groundwork for a much higher level engagement eventually when we get that. But it's also going to mean putting down the megaphones and making and taking certain compromises in the process to get us there.
Yeah. Stavros, just a follow-up that I want to pose to you and Wandile. At this stage, what we understand is that there's been a 90-day moratorium on these reciprocal tariffs, which means that 31% does not come into effect until obviously 90 days from now. We're now down back to the baseline tariff, which again, an arbitrary number that President Trump came up with, but at least there's a universal number that applies to everyone. Now, Stavros, you will remember that when it first came to the initial executive order that affected aid agencies, there was also a 90-day review period, as they say. But since then, it doesn't look like they even started counting down the clock. It doesn't look like there's even a conversation about restoring that particular aid. Is this yet another conversation where they say in 90 days we'll reconsider, and then the president is going to get excited about something else and then nothing happens? What should South Africa do in this 90-day window period?
Look, I think the first thing, it's immensely difficult to try and second guess in this uncertain environment. I mean, their hourly, let alone daily changes, and you don't quite know from day to day what's going to happen, and neither does the administration, incidentally. So the bureaucracy of the United States doesn't know that. You speak to many officials, and they are in as much in the know as you and I are. So it's a very difficult set of circumstances to navigate. What happened with the donor aid is that, yes, there was a 90-day kind of pause period, but what we found on the ground is there was so much confusion and the funds weren't flowing, that facility shut down anyway. So I don't think there's going to be, after 90 days, a backtracking of any great substance with the tariffs. I think the 90 days perhaps could be interpreted as some type of a negotiating lever, where you say, look, I'm going to tariff you at 130% or whatever the number is, okay, with the hope that you react and you come back to the table and I get something favorable from you. I mean, it could be some of that as well at play, but I think just broadly put, I don't think there's going to be a situation in 90 days where President Trump walks us back and we get back to where we were. I think the prospects of that are zero. I think there are going to be some tariffs and there's going to be a need to do a trade deal with them at a point in time.
Yeah. On that note, the idea of a trade deal, you mentioned that Kenya has probably started that pathway that we should all probably still be following. I know that Lesotho has been trying to reach out to the White House in order to kind of understand what the implications are. Does South Africa stand a chance? I mean, we understand where we are diplomatically. We don't have an ambassador. An ambassador has been expelled, which is, I suppose, as extreme as you can get. So this conversation of a trade deal, even if we're out to initiate it, I assume it's not an overnight process. What becomes the mechanics? What can we do as South Africa over the next 90 days and beyond?
Yeah. So, Kaya, the aspect of a trade deal is not cognizant of an ambassador. With an ambassador or no ambassador in the US, we can still progress with that. It gets to be technical. On average, in general, negotiating a trade agreement will take you anything between 3 to 8 to 10 years. It's a long-term process. It can't be resolved overnight, which is why some of us were stretching our hair when people say, okay, just forget what you have, switch to another market. There's a commercial relationships that are there, but also there's a technical aspect of negotiating these trade-offs that take some time and the legal path of this. In our thinking, what South Africa should be following, at least in the near term, look at the basket of what is it that we send to the US. What are the most sensitive products? You have those that are imperishables in the food, citrus that are coming into harvest in about 2 to 3 weeks' time. They may benefit from the gap of this 90 days. But then you have the autos and the other perishables that are coming later in the year, the autos that are continuing, the mining, which is under the certain tariff preference that they have set out. So think about the basket of all of these products. And then we map up the near-term arrangement as to whether we ask for quotas or whatever form that we express to the US. But I think we make it clear that we are beginning with the trade deal aspect. And I mean, South Africa has officially made this point. If you read Vincent Magwenya's statement that he put out last week after the president of the US announced the tariff, South Africa was clear at the presidency that we want this. You read another statement that was issued by Minister Lamola jointly with Minister Parkstown. The first 2 points make this clear. They say in the first point that they want a near-term form of engagement so that commerce continues, whatever form that must be negotiated. Secondly, the trade agreement and diversification is something they are looking at. So this is all to say everything must begin now, and that engagement must be led by the DTIC as well as the economic diplomacy at DERCO and engaging with their counterparts in the US. And I think Stav's point here is important of saying there's a political, there's a business, but I would say even there's a bureaucracy's point. This work needs to begin regardless of what the political winds are waving on, because I think in the long term, it's what will save us in here. Thanks, Kai.
Claude, Soli has said something quite important in the chat that I want to read for you. South Africa will never be able to do the things suggested here, while its foreign policy remains under the sole control of a bunch of people who are stubbornly beholden to archaic Cold War era views of the world. We continue to lose tomorrow because of yesterday. And I suppose that is the elephant in the room, in that even with the ideas that Wandile has spoken about, there is an anxiety that those that we send on our behalf, or those that should represent the national interest, sometimes struggle to untangle their historical political allegiances and alliances and somehow find what the national solution needs to be and what the national agenda needs to be. And I suppose until we have different leaders or different parties in charge, that is what we're stuck with in South Africa. How do we get around it?
Yeah, so this is my point, and I keep saying that there are no technical solutions to political problems, and so South Africa has kind of been able to get its cake and eat it for a long time, but albeit at the cost of very mediocre growth. Right? This is not a growing country. It's a country whose relative share of GDP in the world has stumbled. It's a country that used to be an upper middle income country, is now a middle income country, and within the next 5 to 7 years will be a lower middle income country. Mr. Trump and some of his most radical friends, advisors, influencers are rabidly anti-South Africa, but not anti-South Africa as a whole. They're rabidly anti-ANC and certain factions of the ANC. And absolutely, there's been a very powerful and effective Afrikaner lobby, which is the kind of the dog that caught the car, right? They don't know what to do with this, because the last thing they wanted to be was find themselves in the national spotlight. But this is the animal you're playing with. You're playing with a man and his cult, because that's what they are, who are not just pre-modern in terms of economic theory, but also in terms of political theory. They want to destroy American democracy. And so to take, to what Stavros said earlier, no one knows what's going on in the US, not even people in the White House, 2 officers from Trump. So that will pass. And so the question is, how do you survive that? And how do you prepare yourself for what comes after? And here, nothing that has been said, I'm against. You got to start working on the technical side. You got to start looking at, your positioning in the world. You have to start to understand that the BRICS and the G20 are kind of political virtue signaling for us, but they have no real short-term benefits for South Africa. You have to stop the noise around de-dollarization, because that's going to piss Trump mightily. So just don't be grass under that particular foolish elephant. But at the same time, understand that particularly foolish elephant is fundamentally kind of a mafia don, okay? But he's a mafia don who happens to run the government of the most powerful country on earth. So you can't ignore him, okay? So this isn't about anticipating what he's going to do next, because he doesn't know what he's going to do next. He's not following a plan, he's following an identity, an ontology, who he is, what he does. He's fundamentally programmed to act in a certain way. So if you understand the modus operandi of the guy, it becomes manageable. Right? You can't win against him. You can diminish the least, the higher threat. I mean, sorry, I just want to say, I say to people, prepare for the possibility that Trump may decide in 3 months' time or 6 months' time or tomorrow to send a very powerful signal to South Africa by lobbing a cruise missile at a disused warehouse in Simonstown's port. We're no longer in a world where this is not going to happen, right? It's so do whatever it takes for that kind of stuff not to happen.
All right.
Right?
Yeah. Claude, unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I wish this
I'm so
conversation
sorry for you guys.
Yeah, and I think obviously the most important thing is that at the end of this conversation, the first thing we're all going to check is what is the latest tariff rates between the US and China. It was 125% when it started. I don't think that's the number, but thank you very much to my three panelists for a very, very important and a very insightful conversation. I hope to see you next time, and over to you, Pete.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
You're muted, Pete.
And on, we will have another Pitso. Thank you very much. Another Pitso in about 3 days' time. Stavros, Wandile, my friend, good to see you again. And then, of course, Claude was as philosophical as ever. It doesn't change. Thank you very much. And then, Kaya,
we're just relieved that you didn't ask us to guess what the tariff is going to be at the end of the day against China, because we would.
You're going to get it wrong. You're all going to get it wrong.
So we're very relieved that you didn't ask us.
I keep my eye on the bond market. I think Trump is retreating because of the bond market. So we each have where we look. In any case, but thank you very much for being part of this day, and we hope to see you again. Thanks a lot, Kaya. Goodbye.